LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2015, making Colombo a globally competitive city.
Good evening. I'm not good at sitting in one place, so I have to move around a little. When we were discussing this summit a few months back, Lakshman and I had some interesting conversations about what the appropriate models would be. I, for example, thought that Stockholm would be irrelevant to our reality. You can see who won the argument. The question is there a model to emulate? Or is it that we have to pick bits and pieces from here and there? So that's going to be my first question. But before I come to that question, I'd like to ask Sumila to clarify a thing that the Sri Lankans on the panel had some difficulty with. Is this Sri Lanka?
No.
It's some other country, some hypothetical place.
No, it's a real place.
But not Sri Lanka.
No, it's on. Hello? Can you hear me?
Let me see. Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, no, the data are not for Sri Lanka. It's a real country, and the data are from about 15,000 households in 15 cities of that country.
Ah, okay, because we've done surveys of garbage collection in Colombo, and we basically got flat answers because the garbage collection was actually quite satisfactory.
It was working.
In Colombo, it was working. I mean, it's not working really. Downstream, it's working very poorly. There are some people who are suffering because we are not processing the garbage, but in terms of getting the garbage out of people's sight, we were doing quite well. This was a few years back. So both Diana and I were quite disturbed about this picture, saying, how could this be? This cannot be our country, right?
Well, it's Kenya, actually.
Ah, okay.
And it's data from
Makes us all
just about
feel good.
a year or so ago.
Right.
Right.
So the theme that, somewhere around 5-6 years ago, or maybe more, about 2006, the world tipped from a majority of people living in rural areas to a majority of people living in urban areas. And one of the things that happened as a result of that tipping is that we had a plethora of terms, of buzzwords. So we have smart cities, we have diploma cities, we have, what else has been used today? You didn't use any term, right? Inclusive cities, right? And Lakshman interestingly picked, my choice was responsive city. But Lakshman interestingly picked globally competitive city. I think there's a lot of merit to his choice, because Sri Lanka is, quite contrary to a lot of people who live here, to their perceptions, we are extraordinarily globalized in terms of dependence on exports, dependence on imports, dependence on income for people who travel abroad, percentage of people who travel abroad, etc. We are extraordinarily globalized. And it is very clear that we have to deal with this competition with other countries, with other cities. So I would like to pose as the first question, I'm going to only ask two people, and Mr. Zetterberg, you are excluded from this question because I know your answer. What is the comparator city that you'd like to benchmark, you think Sri Lanka should be benchmarked against? Professor Mendes.
I think as the previous speaker mentioned, Colombo must develop its own. If we go to benchmark and if we go to copy for the sake of copying and not pick up things, ideas must be picked up. But Colombo's design, Colombo's approach to this must be not an introvert, but ability to create its own city that it can live with.
So you're not giving a clear answer. You disagree with the idea of benchmarking.
Benchmarking theoretically is a good thing to pick up ideas, but not to copy. Not to copy.
I think Michael pointed out that Siena, everybody has tried to copy, but no one has succeeded. So I hope you don't answer my question in terms of Siena.
No, of course not. And I would agree that you have to find your own identity for whatever you're doing. But I think copying with pride is a good thing to do. And so I like things that Singapore is doing, especially in terms of, number one, being efficient really down to the last detail, because they have this real need for being efficient on everything, material, energy. And also driving innovation. They're really a very vibrant city on moving forward on innovation. In terms of just beauty, of course, there are some other Italian cities which are nice as well. In terms of dynamic, also, I think one could look at some American cities in Silicon Valley or in California. There are also some cities which have had hard times and still are recovering.
Despite the sprawl, despite the traffic?
No, I wouldn't take this, not at all. I would just take the way how they look forward and how their ability to move 180 degrees around once they have figured out that something is a wrong direction. That is something I admire at the American attitude, that they don't stick too long to false ideas once they have acknowledged it's wrong.
Olaf, you talked about the factors for Sweden, for Stockholm, and when did you say the underground was built?
It was built after the Second World War, but the decision was taken in the city council in 1941 when Hitler's army dominated the whole continent.
41, and then 9 years.
Then it started. It took 10 years to build it, and it was integrated in the beginning of the 50s. But can I comment on this about the role model city? Because, of course, I'm not advocating for you to bring up, Stockholm or Siena as a kind of city that you're going to be like, because every city has to be unique, of course. But there are some general, I would say, take away from what I try to say, and that is, of course, I must say, public transportation needs some infrastructure. You need that bus lane, of course, and that is infrastructure. You must admit that. Okay, good. So you need some of it, and you need the fiber optics cable grid. That's infrastructure too. Yeah, that can't be solved by Uber. So that's my point. But you have to pick up from different cities and be unique, because all cities that has been successful are unique. They are not claiming that they are the New York of Scandinavia or the London of Asia or something. That is totally wrong, because you will end up on a good day to be number 2.
Precisely. So, for example, let's look at waste management in the United States. One company called Waste Management, that's the name of the company, dominates. It's a giant. No one could compete with them. A new startup called Rubicon Global just got $50 million in backing, has created an online platform for smaller garbage hauling companies and recycling companies to connect with residentials and corporations, which is, before they couldn't compete with waste management and the waste management giants, right? So again, thanks to digital technologies and platform technologies, it's transforming a whole industry that was dominated by one player, right? So huge infrastructure areas are being transformed in a very, and creating jobs, creating more opportunities and a level playing field for other organizations and smaller startups, more nimble startups. So what I meant was, you need the basic infrastructure, you need sewage, you need running water and so on and so forth, but look around for how digital technologies can streamline that and make it faster, make it more nimble, and dematerialize a lot of urban infrastructure, right? Like, for example, DVDs to MP3s. There's a lot of other ways we can dematerialize cities and make them more efficient and sustainable.
Nayana, I know you'll have another shot at this tomorrow, but would you like to comment on what the appropriate adjective is, the way you see the world?
Yeah, well,
competitive,
yeah,
inclusive.
I think it's interesting. I mean, hearing all these speakers. But in terms of your first question of where would you benchmark, I would agree with Professor Mendes that we need to find really what will work for us. So I don't think you can benchmark city to city, but I think you can look at comparator cities for certain pieces and say, look, let's take transport for example. Who do we really want to be like, and who do we aspire to be in terms of mass transit? For example, who do we want to be like in terms of housing? Who has really good models of waste management? So I think you can take pieces from different cities and assemble something to deal with the models, or deal with the issues that we have. And I think that's really the way.
I'm getting a lot of questions from the audience about waste management and traffic congestion. So would you like to talk about the comparators in either of these areas?
Yeah, so waste management, I think Stockholm is probably one of the best in the world. And I think that was the ACE card.
I think you're now in a situation where you're importing other people's garbage to recycle, right?
Yes, we have a lot of incineration plants to work with the heating system and the district heating system. But we are not, I will downsize our glory a little bit, because there are some parts of the waste management system that is not so efficient, actually. A lot of trucks going around in the city. But we have in some new areas introduced a vacuum system where you transport by vacuum in pipes the garbage, and that has been quite successful. And the company actually developed there is now selling this product all over the world. It's very expensive, I must say, very expensive. So if you don't have so much money here in Colombo, don't start with that.
Yes, Michael.
And this question of what is the right infrastructure brings us all of a sudden to the question, what is the right governance? Because as you pointed out in Stockholm, this has been a long-lasting process of development and planning and then financing in the end. And I'm now coming from Switzerland, and we are now, I'm not a Swiss, but Switzerland is now inaugurating a 50-kilometer tunnel through the Alps, which has been started planning also in the 40s, 50s. So after 60 years of planning and realization, you can have great ideas, but it takes time, and also then it takes the governance to overcome this time. So this lasts longer than 4 years term of a government, and you have to have this governance which really wants such kind of infrastructure, which is willing to also fund it on a long period of time.
Does it mean that we should have a kind of an appointed authority for metro governance for the megapolis? Is that what you're suggesting? Because when you have elections, it's so almost a pattern here that people change parties.
I would assume that it's a mixture of really having in-house experts on how infrastructure works and how to plan it. So this is an administrational task, but also the backup by governance, which is then a political target. So I think you need definitely both, the expertise and the governance and the support.
If I could,
go ahead.
If I could just respond to that quickly, I absolutely agree. I think Sri Lanka has to do a better job of planning. Clearly, it has to do a lot better job of execution, and I think that's going to be the real challenge. Now, I think we've launched into this phase of doing a lot of in-depth planning. So I think a lot of that is happening, and a lot of these new ideas are coming in. We're talking to lots of different places, but the question comes down to, when it comes down to putting stuff in the ground or getting stuff done, what are the systems that are going to be in place? How do we govern? What are what works, what doesn't? What kind of capital do we get? Are we really ready to embrace private capital, for example? Are we ready to do the kind of diligence, the kind of policy reforms that we will need to make some of these big initiatives happen? That's the question, and I think that's something that's squarely where we need to, where we really need to spend a lot of time.
I was planning to ask a few more questions on my side, but the audience has to be given at least half an hour. And that's where we are now. So let me take some of these questions from the audience. While it is lovely and exciting to build shining cities and to hope economic growth will follow, why don't we also create a long-term facility to start the companies that can design products that the world wants to buy? So basically this is about this, and I think there was another one, about cities as engines of growth, as producing economic growth, rather than the conception that Professor Mendes talked about, cities as living off the rural areas. So by developing these cities, can we actually get economic growth generated? Maybe Sumila?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, the research that I showed a little bit in my presentation clearly shows that South Asia, Sri Lanka and South Asia as a region as a whole is not leveraging urbanization for economic growth as much as it could. Sri Lanka is a little bit better on livability, and you can see certain agglomeration economies, but there is no one-to-one relationship between the urbanization level today in Sri Lanka and economic growth. So it's critical that...
But on that, now,
yes.
Do you accept the minister's number, which is 48%?
Yes, actually...
And the number that has been kicked around, which is 15%?
Yes, I totally agree with the minister. All of South Asia understates its urbanization level relative to, say, Latin America. So our figures were roughly the same. I think the statistics in terms of what is rated as urban in Sri Lanka gives you 14 to 18%. And if you look at the agglomeration, it's about 47% urban. And so why is it in India, it's the same story? And the reason has traditionally been that the rural areas got more national subsidy programs. And no administration wanted to be called urban. That dynamic may be shifting, but at the very least, if the council that is managing an urban area is a rural council, you're not going to see the kind of planning and urban management you need to see for productive urban growth and management. So what I'm saying is, for example, if you have a region in which a large proportion in terms of governance, large number of people sitting on the council are from rural areas, then the taxation from urban areas can go towards rural investment as opposed to being plowed back into urban investment, and which is required to keep pace with the growing population and the demand in urban areas, which is in turn required to reduce the congestion effects that you're seeing, the shortages in infrastructure, water supply, in housing and things like that.
I feel you're talking about Karnataka and Bangalore.
Also,
that's the tension, where Karnataka, the state government, is always getting in the way of Bengaluru being developed.
Certainly, I think India's biggest problem in urban development is its governance structure, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's exactly the same in Sri Lanka.
So we have to empower the city governments, the local governments, versus the provincial governments. Professor Mendes, what are your thoughts?
I think that's a good way of putting it. It's not only empowering, but making the reforms and let the power structures through the reform process show the ability to accept that. The issue is not that they don't have the powers legally, it's the way that they are not willing to exercise them. And somewhere that is the blockage that we have to get rid of. And that, I think she quite rightly mentioned, has been a South Asian dilemma. How do you get rid of the blocks?
So this question that came from the audience is about innovation. It's about creating an environment where people can innovate. Now, they were also talking about loans and all those kinds of things. Let's leave the loans out. Is creating a habitable, enjoyable, branded, exciting city enough to attract innovative companies? Or do we need more?
Attracting innovation-oriented talent is not only the design and the beauty. Singapore, I think, is expected to provide that kind of image, that if you have beauty, you can also attract talent. It doesn't come that way. One doesn't follow one after the other. The issue is getting the governance right, which I think the previous speaker also mentioned, if that image of efficiency and you know the usual things that come with slow decision-making processes are eliminated, that's the part that attracts the innovation to come without being restricted. No sooner you have 10 institutions to go without a one-stop shop kind of talk.
I think there's a lot of interest in this question. So, JT?
Okay.
JT, go ahead.
Okay, so some practicality in terms of how do you create innovation in cities. Where are the universities in Colombo? Build an ecosystem around those. That's where innovation actually starts to happen. That's where interactions happen. Companies start to build around those because they want talent. They want young talent. Students get early exposure to the corporate world. This whole notion that universities should be way outside cities is very wrong. They create bubbles. They create students that come out of university having no exposure to the real world. Create an ecosystem around that. Create micro infrastructure, libraries. Have digital labs in libraries, not just about books. Have 3D printers in them. Have tools where people could come in and produce things, right? Create incubators places. Invest in incubators where you have local local advisors who have entrepreneurial experience to give advice. Those are the basics to start spurring education, innovation, right? It's interactions. When you create, when one person meets, it's like this conference. You have to emulate this conference on an everyday basis, in a real-time basis in cities, right? Where people interact, bump into each other. I could be an artist, you can be a engineer. What comes out when you combine your expertise with my expertise? Something very new and innovative. And then we're living in 2015, we're forgetting that. Always we forget that, right? The cost of barrier into creating companies is more cheaper than ever before. We have all kinds of free tools thanks to the Googleization of the world, right? We have all kinds of knowledge resources thanks to the internet again. We have, you know, you can have cafes. A lot of people work out of cafes. Cafe culture is actually my biggest recommendation for cities that want to spur innovation. If you look at the best cities in the world, they have a big, huge cafe culture.
You would be happy to learn that Colombo is awash in cafes now. Naina.
I just like to pass that question into two, really, because I think to spur innovation and to really make these things happen, there's two things that are required. One is the physical. The physical you cannot get away from. The infrastructure, the open spaces, make them a nice place to live, as you were saying. But I do not think that is enough. That's often mistaken for being enough. To make what JT talks about happen requires a really good policy environment for entrepreneurs to start businesses easily, to fail and pick up again easily, to connect with the world easily. For like Sri Lanka, it's not really that easy to fail at the moment. If anybody started and tried to shut down a business, it takes a year to shut it down. It takes a week to start it up. So failure is really bad. We still can't take PayPal. So I think there's simple enabling things which are soft, really in the policy realm, that need to happen to make these ecosystems work and make innovation possible. But that can only happen that, you know, simultaneously we must create the canvas on which the city evolves, on which, you know, we build places to live and work. I think that has to be done, and we have some catching up to do on that.
Yes.
Yeah, could I have one more remark on what I don't think that you should do here in Colombo, and that is to work with economic incentives, because that is very easily done and set up, and then you attract maybe some companies, people to come, and then they go away when some other have, raising the bar a little bit. So don't work with that, because if you go to yourself when you're going to vacation, are you looking for the country that is the most cheap to visit? I don't think so. You look for the country that you want to visit, and then if it's not so expensive, it's good. But you're not looking for the cheapest vacation country to go to. So I'm a little bit warn you about the incentive thing. That's my.
Yeah, but I think his point was not about incentives. It's the loans that came from the audience. But your point was about creating the business environment.
I think basically it needs to go beyond physical. It goes into the policy.
But I would also add that a few years back, I was involved in negotiations that led to the expansion of the business process outsourcing industry here in Colombo, which is you could say a sort of low-end IT-enabled sector. And one of the difficulties that we had was they wanted their clients to be able to get from the airport to the sites, to the office parks, the buildings, relatively quickly. So the traffic congestion is a serious issue. So you can't say that is IT-based and infrastructure doesn't matter. So I was trying to sell them Malame, which was designated by the government as the IT zone, and I had no success whatsoever. And now Malame will become more attractive because it's now proximate to the circular highway. So I can sell Malame now, but I couldn't sell it in 2002, 2003. So I think we need to look at all these aspects. Now I want to get to the audience has a great interest in garbage. So lots of questions on garbage. And I have a great interest in garbage too. So I'm very sympathetic to this. Now I want to correct a little bit of this, which is, one is that the people of Colombo don't really have a garbage problem. Their garbage is collected. It's downstream that we got problems. And downstream problems are concentrated in particular areas. The particular areas are Kardiana, which is on the shores of the Bolgoda Lake, and Mitotamulla. Those are the two places where this is going on. Somebody had written about Blumendal, but we ruined Blumendal long before. We are not doing it anymore. So these are the two places that we are creating extraordinary discomfort for our people. And of course, we had plans to ship it out by train. And looks like that one is also dead in the water. So, Professor Mendes, any thoughts on this subject?
I would be a billionaire if I had a solution, quick fix to that. I think technology has to come in, and the sheer aspect of collecting and dumping is not the best solution, and technologically speaking. The issue now is whether there has been a concerted effort to find a way forward. Our amount that we collect, 7 tons or 8 tons per day, is not that big in terms of what happens in most countries, if you want to emulate. The issue is there a idea that has not been tested or tried out to see whether there are other technological options that can be done? As you said, one option is take it by train to Puttalam or wherever, and then somebody there will say, not in my backyard.
Where we had dug out the ground for the cement factory.
Backyard, absolutely. So if that is the case, then we have to find a way out technologically, because if people don't want to accept the dumping, either by transfer or by collection, let the companies come out with ideas. Why should the government be the only one that...
So isn't this an ideal problem for the megapolis? Because if Colombo is too small, which I agree Colombo is too small, but if we process all the garbage from all the urban conglomerations in the Western Province, then do we not have proper scale for efficient processing? Yes, Nayan?
Actually, I think we do have adequate scale. So
even in Colombo or Colombo plus?
Colombo produces about 600 tons of garbage a day. The greater Colombo region produces about 1,600 tons of garbage a day. And you're right, right now it actually gets dumped in 2 places, one in Mitotamulla and one in Karadiana. So we actually have a few solutions that we are working on. The megapolis is very much part of this. Because what we have, the problem we have is we dump garbage, we don't process it.
There is a degree of processing that happens at Kardiana.
Yeah, but it's marginal at best, right? So what we have to do is find ways to process it at these sites, and that's an active debate going on now. It's at least in my personal opinion, you have to introduce some waste to energy technologies to manage waste at these sites. There is also, of course, the plan of Arua Kalu, and that is not dead. It's actually ongoing. There's an environmental impact assessment ongoing on the viability of that. So I think again, the problem is downstream, but the introduction of some processing is required. What we're looking at is trying to get that processing done through private sector investors. We understand that there's some policy impediments to doing that, because just on the electricity tariffs alone, it's not viable. So we need to introduce some ways to improve the viability of these, whether it's an increase in preferential tariff or whether it's some kind of tipping fee. So there's policy measures that need to be worked out. But I'm very confident that you can solve them, and we're in active discussion on these, and we expect we'll actually go to market with something in the next couple of months, in fact, for one of the major sites.
Yes, Michael.
So I would try another statement on this, making this up while talking. I wonder whether this is not also a matter of general mentality, because we have this garbage problem all over the world. And by the way, I'm also not sure whether digital could be the solution, or is not rather the problem of it, because since we have this digital services which deliver your shoes and your goods and whatever in time to your house, since then we have a lot of more garbage than when we went to the store and purchased our stuff there. It was a little bit the same 20 years ago with the digitalization and with the printers coming up. Everyone told us there will be no more paper needed, because you just make your document on your computer and then print it out, and that's it. The opposite was true. We never had more paper consumption since then, because you print it out, something is wrong, you can change it easily, you print it out again. So it's about the mentality of how can we close the loops again. It is the mentality about valuing such materials, valuing this plastic can of water as a resource, and not dumping it somewhere, just thinking about how you can reuse or recycle this in a way that you don't leave any trace, which is difficult because it's not economically a case at the moment. This is too cheap compared to my labor, and compared to other costs, this is far too cheap. So to overcome this, it requires also a way of thinking, what are we doing with our resources and how can we circulate them back to the cradle?
Yeah, I just want to say there is no one solution, right? You have to have an army of solutions for solving the waste problem, right? Reducing waste, controlling waste, processing waste, closing the loop. The circular economy is a huge topic right now. How do you take garbage and repurpose it? So there is no virgin materials anymore, right? You're just reusing the materials again and again in a circle. So, it needs creative governance, right? For example, Bangalore is actually one of the most innovative waste management city in the world actually right now. What they've noticed, and you need a bit of anthropology. You need to understand the city, how it works, what's going on in the city. And what Bangalore noticed was that there's this huge informal recycling collectors, right? These people who go around collecting plastic or cardboards and so on, and selling those. What they did then was formalize those informal garbage recycle collectors, right? Give them a uniform and created a company out of it, paid them a little bit, and now they have this little mini economy going on. So that was one
That is
solution.
for garbage collection.
Yeah, there is.
Sri Lanka has privatized garbage collection in many of our cities.
No,
it works perfectly.
They converted informal garbage
our
collectors.
problem is downstream.
Right.
Our problem is not in collecting the garbage. We actually have a clean city. It's downstream where we put it there and forget about it.
Okay, so you can't look at like Japan or Stockholm with these expensive incinerators, right? They're way too expensive. The operation costs are way too expensive. So you have to look at ways of stricter regulations, tighter regulations, right? On what kind of products are allowed. You guys serve food on banana leaves in a lot of. That's a good culture to actually strengthen.
I can tell you that I went to school with taking my lunch in a banana leaf, and there's actual shortage of banana leaf in this country.
Strengthen that culture.
This is the kind of stuff I hear all the time. It doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, when you live in a city, you live in an apartment block, how on earth are you going to get banana leaf to pack your lunch? It wasn't possible when I lived in the suburb of Kotte those days. It's not possible now, increasingly. Let me move on to another question that the audience is asking about funding. They want to know how all this will be paid for. But I'm going to combine, because we are running out of time, I'm going to combine it with another question. There's several questions about the mass transit lines. Some are saying that the first mass transit line is going to be from the airport to Colombo. I don't think so. I think the original plan was Malabé to the city of Colombo. My understanding of those was that they were going to be public-private partnerships, and that most of the money would come, some stories I have heard, that all the money would come from the investor, and they would then be able to set the prices. So the question is in two parts. Some people, like Sumila, would be able to talk about funding per se. I hope somebody else will talk about public-private partnerships or complete private concession model as a solution. Nayana, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to start. I think the bottom line on the mass transit in Sri Lanka, it needs to happen clearly. I think we've got a whole panel on it, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But the fact is, I think the government will need to spend some amount on the capital cost. The operations and maintenance can be done. The concession for operations can be done privately, and I think the fare box is marginal at best. So in my opinion, the way to unlock this, the only way Sri Lanka can really unlock mass transit is if they take station-linked or transit-linked real estate very, very seriously. That's the way it's done in Japan, that's the way it's done in Singapore, that's the way it can be done in Sri Lanka. It basically, you introduce transit, it drives up real estate values along those corridors. If you join that, if you link that with land use controls that allow the extraction of higher values and let that value extraction cross-subsidize the transit construction cost or the operations, that's the way Sri Lanka will have to do it. I don't think there's a model out there. I think the PPP is an often overused word to think that the private sector will pay everything. I don't think that will happen. I think the state will have to spend something. But I think the operations of these can be incredibly attractive and viable. And if you look at it from an economic perspective, I think going into mass transit and making them happen is fundamental to the success of Colombo. It's fundamental transformation that we have to make. So we have to make it happen one way or the other.
So Sumila, just to preface the question to you, Colombo is currently the beneficiary of about $500 million US in World Bank and ADB money. World Bank is about 225, and the ADB sewerage project is also in that same range. Is this enough? Or what do you think? What's your response? How will we pay for all these improvements?
Okay, clearly it's not enough, otherwise you wouldn't have asked me the question. And also, I mean, the first estimate for the train, the mass transit system, somebody mentioned was $2.9 billion. So clearly, this kind of money is a very large amount of money, and the question is, how do you think about it? I think there are two pieces to this. First, you have to figure out what are the kinds of things that you as a government want to subsidize. And I think the idea that, I completely agree with Nayana, I don't know of very many mass transit systems that are completely running on fare box. Nowhere, Chicago, New York, DC, Stockholm, it just doesn't happen. And so the question that arises in transport policy is, if the roads are free, and the government is paying for them, then why is it that mass transit has to be fully recovered from the fare box? So I think there is something that you need to think about there. The second point that Nayana made is also very important. You can put in a line and the real estate values around it will go up. But do you have a system for densifying that corridor by changing the zoning regulations and FSI? And what is your system for capturing the improvement that's coming? So for example, in the train system or the subway system that was built in Delhi, the transport system sits alone and separate from the land use plan. And so it's the transport authority that's building it, and the linkage between the two is hard to do. That is not the case, for example, in Hong Kong, where the land use and the train station designs were very closely integrated. So that's another very good point that Nayana made that I want to underscore. The thing about funding, the other piece that you asked me about, well, I think there needs to be further decentralization of fiscal responsibility to the city level. There needs to be a better effort on tax collection, whether it's property taxes, betterment levies, and things like that. There also needs to be a stronger intergovernmental system where the transfers from the center to cities or states and provinces are more formula-based and reliable as opposed to ad hoc. So as those systems evolve, you can then have certain cities like Colombo can move towards a credit rating and go to municipal bonds and things like that, but very few cities outside of things like places like Colombo will be able to do that. So financing continues to be a major challenge. All sources are necessary: taxation, intergovernmental transfers, external financing on good terms, and prudent expenditure, right? So you won't be able to fund too many projects that run into billions of dollars and recover 5 or 10% of costs. So you need a framework for prioritizing which places those subsidies will go. And the framework could be things like, what is it that gets you to your goal of an inclusive or green city, where the citizens have a livable environment and a decent chance of having a decent standard of living. So there can be no innovative city if all the workers have to live 75 kilometers out because only the owners of those innovative companies can afford to live in the city. That won't work.
So that's a central question, actually a question that was asked of the minister, but I didn't want to bring it up because the minister is no longer here. But I'll pose it to you. One of the challenges, I think from what you may have seen of Colombo is not any kind of high-rise city. It's quite low-rise. And the difficulty, of course, is getting this density up. And one of the great challenges we had in the last few years was that there was a lot of opposition to putting people who were being moved out of illegal settlements, and in some cases legal settlements that were sitting on valuable real estate, into, I think, 15 floors, 10, 15 floor buildings. I can remember I made the argument that people can't handle elevators. They mess up elevators. You require a certain culture to deal with elevators. And I was arguing for 4 stories. And I was posed the challenge, okay, I'll give you 4, but you'll have to go to Homagam. Because that's where the land is, for buildings that are 4 stories high. If you want to keep the people inside the city, you'll have to live with 15-story housing blocks. So how does one deal with that challenge? Any thoughts? How do we deal with low-income
with the elevators? I don't know, but on the other question, maybe there were so many wise comments on the panel. But just to add something. In the case of Stockholm, for example, the city of Stockholm get hold of the land in the inner city when the underground metro was built, and then had land lease contracts, and then every year got good incomes out of those land lease contracts. That is one way of doing it. And then to make a statement that is not so politically correct, but a couple of years ago, I was in Cape Town, and they said that it was extremely important in the commuter trains to have first class, because the first class passengers who used the commuter trains, they paid a lot of money, and the other ones who was traveling, in second or third class, they didn't pay that much. But it was extremely important to have this first class departments of the train. It's not politically correct, I know, but I say it, but I'm just quoting what my colleague in Cape Town said. Yeah.
Yes, Nayan.
So this is a problem we're actively dealing with. So I'm happy to speak a couple of words on it. I think we're actually UDA is working on this plan to move people into 10-story buildings. So we have 65,000 slums and shanty houses in Colombo, and they occupy 900 acres of real estate. So there is really no land shortages in Colombo. There is land underutilization. That's a core problem. So the original plan for building high-rises was, let's move people into high-rises and then free up all this land, and there's plenty of space for commercial real estate. what we've then found, and we're dealing with now, is that really doesn't work, as Rohan said, because we're moving communities that are used to living on the ground with very interesting social networks into vertical situations that doesn't always work. So now what we're trying to do, we understand that the social issues are just as important as the physical issues. And we're now working with some of these communities. We're actually doing some pilots in one of these communities in a new building that we're going in to really work with them socially and look not as, look, we're going to move you from this slum into what may become a future vertical slum, but really look and say, what do you need to transform your life? And how can this real estate play a role in that? So, I mean, just to put it in context, you're taking somebody that lives in a 100 or 200 square feet wood shack, and you're putting them into a 400 to 500 square foot apartment that is valued at 4 million rupees, just construction cost alone. So there's a huge, and you're legalizing and formalizing them, and you're giving them collateral in a completely different way. But what we have not done, and what we're starting to do, is really engage them on livelihoods, on education, on empowering them, so that this transformation is actually complete. It's not just a physical, but really support them through this transition. And also look at optionality, not forcing everybody to go into these, but give people the option and have a mix of options of, yes, some 4-story, some high-rise. But how are you going to clear the land? I don't think you need to clear all the land. I don't think you need to clear...
What about illegal settlements? People who are living by the canals,
most of the 65,000 are illegal.
They're
so
gone.
our stance is this. These people, you can look at it as, look, they're pests, or you can look at them as a resource. I mean, these people are the ones that make the city work. They're the maids, they're the drivers, they're the street cleaners. So you agree they should be kept in the city? I absolutely think they should be kept as close as possible to the city, as much as possible in the city. It needs to happen. So we've got to increase the density. How are we going to do increase the density without 15-floor buildings? No, I think even if you go to 4 stories, even if you go to 6 stories, it's a mix that you actually can accomplish it. Because if you look at the settlements, and even if you go to 4-story, you do economize. You don't get as much land clearing as we might have originally planned. But by offering a mix of solutions, there are some parties that would be perfectly fine in a high-rise. Some will not be, and that's where I think the optionality has to come in. You can't take 65,000 people and give them one solution. 65,000 people need multiple solutions, and through those multiple solutions, you can find a problem.
Well,
but
Singapore did it, but
Singapore's not a democracy,
with a lot of
right?
rules.
So
we compare. You from doing X and Y and Z.
Look, we get compared to Singapore ad nauseum, right? I personally have an issue with that. I think Singapore is great. Yes, it's beautiful. All that is good.
No, I'm talking about taking people who are living in slum-like conditions and moving them into the HDC housing.
Yeah, so
in the 70s,
there's a success story there, but the enforcement ability of a government in Singapore is fundamentally different than the enforcement ability of Sri Lanka. I mean,
good point. And I would also say these high-rise solutions are rather the top end of solutions of bringing people in housing efficiently. And we are involved in some projects in India and also in Indonesia, which we call urban acupuncture, and it's exactly the same. So we tend to leave people, or we support leaving people in those informal settlements, because that's where they're at home, and that's what they love, and that's where they can grow. So they will grow out of this informal settlement, and they, as you put it, they are operating the city. And so you can make 4 stories is high, but you can make 2 or 3 stories within those constructions with those people, involving those people, enhancing them, training them on working and masonry capabilities, and then grow a formal settlement slowly out of an informal one. It works. And then it even can become really beautiful.
Yes, I think we'll give Sumila the last word.
That's a real privilege. I'm just coming from India, where we were looking at sites and services projects that were funded by the World Bank, the last of which closed 20 years ago. When they were finished, everybody said, oh, these are a failure. They took too long to implement, and there's nobody there. And 20 years later, these are thriving communities that are up to 5 stories high on 25 and 21 square meter plots, and some of them are 40, 50, 60, 70. At the time when these ideas were introduced in the late 70s all over the world, nobody wanted to buy into these ideas, because we wouldn't want people to live like cattle, you see. So the ideas were too far ahead of their time. And it took 20 years for these to become multi-story and hyper-dense settlements. And not all of them. There are some that were poorly located and were never occupied, but the vast majority in Chennai and Mumbai, which is where I was just last week, are thriving. So I think there are several different options. Multi-story is only one. I think small plotted developments that are incrementally increased by people who can build over time are a solution, but they take time. All urban development takes time. In a 5-year project or a 5-year political term, you will not see the result. But if you put that framework in place and give it time, it will get there. So I think it's very important to look at a series of options and start that housing discussion again. I think too many cities from New York to Paris to Colombo to Delhi have given up on having affordable housing in the city. And we cannot afford to have cities that are completely divided, where the rich live in multi-million-dollar apartments in New York, and the apartments in New York are empty because they're owned by the rich people from Saudi Arabia, from China, from India, and the people there cannot afford to live there. So that kind of sort of non-inclusive city development is not the goal we want to go towards. Thank you.
I thought you'd leave me with an optimistic note.
Yes, it takes time.
I think it's not really optimistic because it takes time, and time is what we do not have in this country. So maybe it's a mixed optimistic, pessimistic note. So with that, I have been instructed to shut down the session. We could go on for another hour easily. I'm sorry I apologize to the audience for not doing justice to all their questions, but I did the best I could given this large panel. So let me thank you on behalf of the audience and on behalf of the organizers for a wonderful start to what I hope will be a very exciting infrastructure summit.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2015, making Colombo a globally competitive city.